She wore her veil with pride. She came in peace. But in Paris, they treated her like she was nothing. What they didn't know, she was the president of Tanzania. It was early morning when the plane from Tanzania landed in Paris. The air was cold, the sky gray. But inside the airport, something bigger was about to happen. President Samia Suluhu Hassan stepped off the plane, calm and graceful. She wore a long dress, and on her head, her Muslim veil, soft and clean, just like she always wears it. She didn't come to fight. She didn't come to show off. She came to speak at a world leaders meeting, to represent Tanzania, and to stand for Africa. But as soon as she reached the passport check, something felt wrong. The French officer looked at her passport, then at her veil. Then he frowned. "Remove that," he said in English, pointing at her scarf. She said softly, "I am the President of the United Republic of Tanzania." But he didn't care. "Take it off, madam," he repeated. "This is France." Behind her, Tanzanian officials tried to explain. They showed documents. They called other security officers. Still, she was told to step aside. She was searched. She was questioned. Not once did they say, "Your Excellency." Not once did they say, "Welcome." She stood there for over 40 minutes, in silence. People walked by. Some stared, some laughed. One officer whispered to another, "She looks like one of them." But she didn't cry. She didn't shout. She stood still, with dignity. And when they finally realized who she was, it was too late. The damage was done. President Samia turned around, looked at her team, and said quietly, "We are going home." And with that, she refused the summit. She boarded her Tanzanian state plane and flew back to Africa. But what happened in that airport would not stay quiet for long. The sun had not yet risen over Dar es Salaam when President Samia's plane touched down. She did not speak to the press. She did not shout on television. She walked off the plane with her veil still on, her head held high, and went straight to the State House. But the silence did not last long. Someone on her team, maybe a guard, maybe a staff member, leaked the truth. And like fire catching dry grass, the story spread across the country, then across the continent. Radio stations interrupted their programs. President Samia humiliated in Paris. She was stopped like a common criminal because she wore a veil. On social media, the youth reacted first. One girl in Zanzibar posted, "If they treat a president like this, how will they treat our mothers?" Another in Nairobi wrote, "She went to speak peace." They answered with racism. Across the Muslim world, voices rose up. She is a Muslim. She is a woman. She is a leader. And still they disrespected her. Even in cities like Dakar, Abuja, and Khartoum, people who had never followed Tanzanian news before were now shouting her name. Samia, the mother, the leader, the one who stood in silence, but said more with her eyes than any speech ever could. Back in France, their government scrambled. A small statement came out. "It was a mistake. We apologize." But it was cold, dry, and too late. Because Africans knew the truth. This wasn't just a mistake. It was an insult to her veil, to her faith, to her skin, to her continent. And now the world was watching. And Africa was rising. The streets of Dar es Salaam were full of whispers. Old men sat under mango trees discussing the shame. Mothers in the market shook their heads. University students raised their fists. Everywhere, the people were asking the same thing. Why? Why did they treat her like that? It wasn't just Tanzanians. Across Africa, the story reached every corner. In Senegal, imams spoke her name in Friday prayers. In Nigeria, women's groups held silent protests in front of French embassies. In Egypt, a popular TV host shouted, "The veil is not a crime. France has crossed the line." But President Samia stayed silent. For days, she said nothing. People waited. Was she afraid? Was she angry? No one knew. Then something unexpected happened. A video started to go viral. It was not from her office. It was from a young girl, maybe 14 years old, from a village near Arusha. The girl wore a veil. She held a Tanzanian flag. She looked straight at the camera and said, "President Samia, we love you. They tried to shame you, but you shamed them with your silence. They thought the veil made you weak, but we saw your strength." That video reached millions. And suddenly, it was not just about politics. It became personal. African women began sharing photos wearing veils, using hashtags like "I am Samia," "Respect," "Ur Veil," "Africa is watching." And in the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Kinshasa, posters appeared overnight. "You touched her veil. You touched all of us." France had tried to ignore it. But now the world was listening. And France was embarrassed. Because a quiet woman in a scarf had made more noise than any army ever could. Pressure built like a storm cloud over Paris. The French government sent another statement, this time longer, more serious. They said the officers at the airport had acted without proper knowledge, and that the Republic of France respects all cultures and faiths. But it didn't matter, because this time, Africa had found its voice. A famous singer from Ghana released a song called "Daughter of Dignity," with President Samia's photo as the cover. In the song she sang, "They tried to make her small, but she walked like a queen. They saw her scarf, but missed her crown." In Sudan, Christian and Muslim women marched together, holding a banner that read, "We cover our heads, not our minds." Even in Europe, some people stood with her. One French journalist said on live television, "We embarrassed ourselves." A woman president was profiled like a criminal just because she was African and Muslim. In Tanzania, the parliament stood in silence for 1 minute. Not to mourn, but to show strength. Then, for the first time since her return, President Samia Suluhu Hassan spoke. It was not a loud speech. It was soft, steady, like a mother speaking to her children and the world. She said, "I came to Paris with hope. I left with disappointment, not for myself, but for what I saw. Fear of what they don't understand. Disrespect for what they refuse to learn." She looked straight into the camera and added, "I will not remove my veil. I will not bow my head. And I will not ask to be treated like a human being. Because I already am." The crowd in Tanzania stood and clapped. But beyond that, millions across Africa clapped in their hearts. Because in that moment, President Samia was not just a leader. She was a mirror. She reflected the pain of many, and she turned that pain into power. Something changed after her speech. You could feel it in the air. In the markets, women wore their veils a little higher. In the mosques and churches, her name was mentioned with respect. In the classrooms, teachers used her story as a lesson, not just about racism, but about dignity. In Nigeria, a young female lawyer said on TV, "She didn't shout, she didn't curse, she stood like a mountain." And that is the strongest protest. In Rwanda, a popular writer said, "They wanted to humiliate her, but she turned silence into strength and shame into gold." In Tanzania, her government quietly canceled upcoming diplomatic visits to France. The message was clear. If you cannot respect our leaders, we will not come to your table. In Paris, the airport where the incident happened released a full report admitting that racial profiling and cultural ignorance had played a role. But it was too late. The world had already chosen a side. And this time, it was not with the old powers. It was with the woman who wore a veil, who stood her ground, who refused to be made small. In Dar es Salaam, someone painted a mural of her on a wall near the harbor. It showed her standing with her hands folded, eyes calm, veil blowing in the wind. At her feet were the words, "We cover with cloth, but we rise with fire." The painting was shared by thousands. Even school children visited it and placed flowers at the base. And across the continent, something rare was happening. Africa was united, not by politics, not by war, but by the quiet courage of one woman. A woman who never raised her voice, but made the whole world listen. Weeks later, the world had not forgotten. France tried again to make things right. They invited her to return. They offered to honor her at a global women's conference. They even said the president of France would issue a personal apology. But President Samia Suluhu Hassan did not go. Instead, she traveled to Kenya, where she was welcomed with open arms and called Mama Africa. In Uganda, she spoke to a gathering of young women and said, "Respect is not given with red carpets. It is shown in how you treat the simplest person at the gate." In Morocco, a group of girls in hijab held up a sign, "We are all Samia." In South Africa, a university held a debate. Is the veil a symbol of oppression or pride? And for the first time, many students said, it could be both or neither. It depends who wears it and why. In Europe, too, something had shifted. Some newspapers who once mocked her now praised her grace. Some feminists who misunderstood her now said, "She showed us a different kind of strength, quiet, patient, but unbreakable." Back in Tanzania, President Samia went to a small village where she was born. There, a little girl ran up to her with flowers and said, "You make me proud to be a girl." She bent down, took the girl's hand, and replied, "Then one day, you will lead too, and may the world see you before it judges you." The crowd around her cried softly, not from pain, but from pride. And that night, as the stars lit the sky, women across the continent wore their veils, some Christian, some Muslim, some with no religion at all, not in silence, not in shame, but in honor, because one woman stood in an airport, refused to bow her head, and taught the world what it means to wear a veil and still shine.